Hiya do, welcome to your history lesson for this week. So we're going to carry on our learning about Matthew Henson. So Matthew Henson was the first man to reach the North Pole. And last week we learned about his journeys to the North Pole and all the challenges that he faced. And I'd like to know if you can remember some of the challenges that he faced on his journey to the North Pole. Why don't you pause the video and write them down, or maybe tell somebody in the room with you. Lovely, well done. We'll probably talk about some of these as we go through, because today we're going to learn all about Matthew Henson's life and some of the other challenges that he faced before he went on his expeditions and after when he returned to America as well. So many explorers that we learn about, they have access to wealth, which means a lot of money and resources. And they also usually come from a family that has allowed them to have education growing up. They've learned to read and write and many other things that you learn as you go to school. But Matthew Henson didn't have this. But this is what probably gave him that resilience, that strength that he needed to be able to travel to the North Pole. Because remember, all those challenges that he faced meant that he had to be really tough, really strong, really, really resilient. So just a bit of context and a bit of background to the time that Matthew Henson was born. Well, Matthew Henson was born in Maryland, which is in America, on the 8th of August 1866. Now, this was just after the end of something called the American Civil War. A civil war is when two groups from the same country are fighting each other for one reason or another. Now, this civil war was being fought because the northern and the southern states of America were arguing about how they wanted America to look. For example, the North wanted to remain united. That means they wanted to stay together. But the South wanted to leave the United States and they wanted to go and make their own country. And the reason they wanted to leave the United States was because that they felt that as the United States, as America got bigger, they would get less power. They would have less say in how they wanted to run and govern their own states. And they thought, well, we won't be able to make our own laws. We won't be able to be in charge of our own states. So they wanted to be independent. Remember, we did that word in science yesterday. Independent means not relying on anybody else for support. So one of the reasons that they wanted to be separate from the northern states was because the northern states wanted to abolish, that means end, they wanted to end something called slavery, which was still happening in the South. So slavery is when someone owns another person and makes them work for them without paying for them, and will usually make them work in really poor conditions as well. And what was happening was, for hundreds of years just before the Civil War, Europeans and Americans were traveling over to Africa on boats, West Africa, and they were essentially kidnapping people from there, bringing them over to the Americas, North and South America, on ships that were awful conditions. Many people got very sick on there, and many people died on those ships as well. But whoever was left by the time they reached America was sold as slaves. Now, the South and the southern states, they wanted to keep slaves because they relied on them very heavily to do all the farming of their main crops, such as cotton and tobacco, which they were making lots of money from. And if they didn't have slaves, then that would mean that it would cost them more money to be able to produce those things. Now, the northern states ended up winning the Civil War, and in 1865, that's just 1 year before Henson was born, slavery was abolished in America. Remember, abolished means ended. However, even though all those African slaves that were brought over and made to work in America were now free, they were still not treated as equals by the other people in America, and they faced a lot of racism because of their skin colour. That means they weren't treated kindly. They weren't given access to things that white Americans were having access to. And that's what racism is. So then what was happening was they had to fight for their equality. They had to fight to be treated as equals, and that's still something that is continuing today. So Matthew Henson's parents were free-born sharecroppers. So this means that they were not technically born into slavery. They were born free. But being a sharecropper means that they had to give a percentage of their crops to the farmer who owned the land. So not technically slaves, but this was still one way in which these Black Africans who had been brought over to America were still being mistreated and not being treated equally, and being used as a way for the people who owned the land to try and make more money and to stop those Africans from being independent. And what happened was Henson's mother died not long after he was born. And when he was 4, his dad moved them to a state called Washington. And the reason they moved was because their dad wanted to find more opportunities to work. But unfortunately, Henson's father died just a few years after they moved. So he had to go and live with other relatives. It's a very young age that Henson was orphaned because both his parents had died, which is really sad. Henson was not happy with his living situation after his family had died, so he ran away from home at 11 years old. And then when he was about 12, he got a job on a ship as a cabin boy. Now the captain of that ship took Henson under his wing. That means that he looked after him and he was teaching him how to read and write and do maths, but also how to navigate. Now, navigate means find your way to different places. That's a really important skill on a boat. So during his time on a ship, Henson had travelled to many places around Africa and Europe as well. So already by this really young age, he's getting lots and lots of experience of what it's like to travel on a boat, what it's like to navigate, what it's like to explore. However, when the captain of the ship died, Henson went back to Washington, where he began to work as a clerk. Clerk is someone who just works in office type duties. It was there that he met Robert Peary. Now, Robert Peary was a military officer, and he was already an explorer. And Robert Peary was so impressed with his sea experience that he hired him to go on an upcoming expedition to Nicaragua with him. Not long after they returned from Nicaragua, Peary and Henson set sail again on another expedition, this time to Greenland. And remember, it was here that Henson learned that local Eskimo culture, including learning their language and their survival skills, which was really useful for then trying to make it all the way to the North Pole. And that trip was disastrous. I don't know if you can remember why. Yeah, I don't know if you remember, they ran out of their supplies and they had to eat all but one of their sled dogs. So like we learned last week, Henson and Peary made multiple attempts to reach the North Pole, but they failed many, many times because of the various challenges they faced. So thinking about what we just talked about a second ago, on that journey to Greenland, where they ran out of their supplies, that was one of the challenges that they faced. Can you think of the other challenges that they faced when they were, on these expeditions trying to make it to the North Pole? Okay, let's have a look at some answers then from last week. So in 1905, they were given a new ship by the President of America, which allowed them to get even further than they had before. However, the melting sea ice blocked their journey, so they had to turn back. Do you remember? They couldn't finish their journey because all that melting sea ice made it too dangerous for them. But in 1902, on one of their attempts, 6 Eskimo men died because of their lack of food and supplies. So you've got to make sure that you take lots and lots of equipment with you on such a long, dangerous journey. So we're just going to recap now some of the things that we learned last week, because this is all interlinked into Matthew Henson's overall life. So in 1908, the team began their final mission to the North Pole. It was their 8th attempt. Henson was crucial to the success of the trip. He built sledges and taught the other men how to use them. As the mission continued into the next year, many members of the team decided to turn back. But despite this, Peary and Henson carried on. Peary knew that he could not do it without Henson. And Peary said, "Henson must go all the way. I can't make it there without him." But remember, Peary was moving quite slowly. He'd lost all but 2 of his toes because of the frostbite, because it was so cold. And finally, on the 6th of April 1909, Peary and Henson finally reached the North Pole with just 4 Inuit men and 40 dogs. Bearing in mind that they started the trip with 24 men, 19 sledges, and 133 dogs. So not many were left by the end. It is said that Henson actually arrived 45 minutes before Peary did, which would make him the first man to reach the North Pole. And remember, his famous quote that he said was, "I think I'm the first man to sit on top of the world." So I want you to pause the video now and have a think. What do you think happened when they returned to America? Okay, hopefully you've got some ideas. Let's have a look then. Well, when they returned, another explorer named Frederick Cook claimed that he had already reached the North Pole a year before Henson and Peary had got there. Can you imagine going all that way, going through all that trouble and all that danger to come home and find that someone had said that they'd already done that a year before you? How disappointing. But luckily, many years later, this was constantly going under an investigation where people were trying to work out who was right and who was telling the truth. The American Congress finally recognized Peary's claim, and they said that Frederick Cook's claim was false and that Peary's claim was accurate. So Robert Peary got all the credit for this, and he was celebrated as a hero by many, and he received several awards and honours. Now, Matthew Henson was overlooked mainly, so that means that people didn't give him the credit that he deserved. People didn't really celebrate his achievements. Why do you think that was? Why do you think that Peary was so celebrated, but Matthew Henson was mainly ignored? Well, if you think back to that time of what it was like in America after the end of the Civil War, just a couple of decades before, where African people who had been brought over to America to be slaves were still not being treated equally. So remember, even though they were free technically, and that they weren't being kept and owned by other people, they were still not being treated equally. So often this meant that people thought that they weren't capable of doing these amazing things because of their skin colour, which is really just not true. And Henson spent the next 30 years working as a clerk. He never forgot his life as an explorer, and he even wrote a book that was released in 1912. This is the cover of his book here, that he wrote all about his journey to the North Pole. In 1937, when Henson was 70 years old, he finally received the acknowledgement that he deserved. Now, as soon as they came back, Peary was immediately invited to be a member of the Explorers Club, but it wasn't until almost 30 years later that Henson was given that same honour and being accepted as a member of the New York Explorers Club. And in 1944, he and the other members of the expedition, not including Peary, were awarded a Congressional Medal. So Peary had all of this stuff as soon as they came back, and his achievement was acknowledged, and Henson had to wait years and years and years. He had to wait decades, tens of years later for that same recognition that Peary got, even though we've already talked about how important Henson was to the trip. Peary couldn't have done it without Henson. Henson had embraced the Inuit culture and learned all the skills, and he taught it to the other men. He was crucial. And even though it said that he got there 45 minutes before Peary, he was still not given that recognition, all because of the colour of his skin. And many years after he died, which was in 1955, he was awarded a Hubbard Medal by the National Geographic Society. So people are now, even today, still learning about all the accomplishments that Matthew Henson did. So Matthew Henson faced many other challenges throughout his life, both before and after his expeditions to the North Pole. So if we think back to what his life was like before he met Robert Peary, and after he returned from his expedition to the North Pole, what other challenges did he face? Pause the video and have a think. Great, hopefully you've got some ideas. Let's have a look then. So Matthew Henson was orphaned at a young age. His mum died not long after he was born, and not long after they moved to Washington, his father died as well. And then he had to go and live with some other relatives. He didn't like that. He ran away from home because he was so unhappy. And then he found a place where he was happy on board the ship. But then a few years after that, the captain who taught him everything that he knew also died whilst Henson was still very young. That's a lot of people who are close to you who suddenly aren't around, which is very difficult to deal with. Obviously, he went on his expedition and he had all those challenges of trying to make it to the North Pole, the harsh weather conditions, being away from his family for a long period of time, the food and the supplies running out, the melting ice causing all those dangers. And then on top of all of that, he was also facing racism from the country where he was from, where he was born. And when he came back from the North Pole, no one gave him the credit for all his hard work. And there was even Frederick Cook saying that he'd already done that a year before Henson and Peary had. So all these things that he had to fight against when really he just wanted to be an explorer. So what we're going to do is we're going to put the life events of Matthew Henson's life in order. So these worksheets are available to download on the Barronwood School website, and they're all interactive as well, where you can literally click on the box and drag it to the correct part of the timeline. So the 1-star challenge, the dates of the events are on the timeline and on the events as well, and you just need to match them together and put them in order. It's probably going to be very difficult to fit them all on top, so you might want to put one here, one under, one over, one under, one over, one under, and I think they'll fit a little bit better like that. The 2-star challenge then, we've got a blank timeline, but you just need to put the dates in order on the timeline again, going over, under, because they probably won't fit if you try to fit them all in the same place. And then the 3-star challenge, you've got the dates on the timeline, but the events are not dated. So you need to read through those events and try to work out which one happened first and then what happened after each of those. It's a very, very tricky challenge. And when you've done that, I'd just like you to have a think to finish the lesson off. What do you think we can learn from Matthew Henson? So just pause the video and again, maybe write down some of your ideas or tell somebody in the room with you. Well, hopefully you've got some good ideas and I'd really love to hear them. For me, I think it's really important to remember that Matthew Henson faced a lot of challenges in his life before the expedition, during the expedition, and after the expedition as well. But he was always resilient, and in the end, he was credited, and people are now celebrating his achievements. And I think it just goes to show that sometimes you can work really, really hard and not feel appreciated, but he just carried on with his expedition and doing what he was passionate about and what made him happy. So I think it's really comforting to think about how he carried on so resiliently despite all of the challenges that he faced in his life. And I think it gives us the nice message that if you really, really want something, you can do it. Thank you everybody for listening to that lesson. I hope you enjoyed it and I'm looking forward to seeing the work that you send in. Bye everyone.